The mid-July sun beat down on the neighborhood playground, casting harsh, elongated shadows across the sandbox and the scuffed rubber matting beneath the swing sets. The air was thick with the suffocating humidity unique to a Japanese summer, filled with the deafening hum of cicadas that seemed to vibrate in the very teeth of the children playing there. Among these children was a 4-year-old Izuku Midoriya. At this age, the world was still simple. It was divided into two distinct categories: heroes and villains, good and evil, the strong and the weak. And in Izuku's wide, emerald-green eyes there was no one stronger, no one cooler, and no one more heroic than his best friend, Katsuki Bakugo. "Look at this, Deku!" Katsuki crowed, standing atop the plastic summit of the jungle gym, his hands on his hips. He was a boy composed entirely of sharp edges and explosive energy, even before his quirk had manifested. But today, the explosions were literal. Small, firecracker-like pops erupted from Katsuki's palms, releasing tiny plumes of acrid smoke that smelled like burnt caramel and ozone. The other children gathered around the base of the jungle gym, their eyes wide with awe, murmuring praises that would soon build the foundation of Katsuki's towering ego. "Whoa! Kaken, that's so amazing!" Izuku cheered from his spot on the swings. He kicked his little red sneakers in the air, his heart swelling with genuine admiration. His best friend had finally gotten his quirk, and it was a flashy, powerful, heroic one. It was perfect. "Of course it's amazing!" Katsuki grinned, a feral, confident thing. "It's the quirk of a #1 hero. I'm gonna beat All Might one day, just you wait." Izuku beamed, gripping the steel chains of his swing. He was still waiting for his own quirk to come in. His mother, Inko, had told him it could happen any day now. Maybe he would breathe fire like his dad, or pull things towards him like his mom. He hoped it was something cool, something he could use to stand side by side with Kaken when they formed their own hero agency. "I can't wait to get my quirk, Kaken!" Izuku called out, his excitement bubbling over. He pumped his legs, swinging a little higher. "Maybe we can be a team," Katsuki scoffed, a tiny burst of sparks popping from his right hand. "Only if your quirk isn't lame, Deku." "I don't need any weaklings holding me back," Izuku laughed, undeterred. He squeezed his eyes shut, imagining what it would feel like to fly, to shoot lasers, to be special. He gripped the heavy, reinforced steel chains of the swing tighter, letting his excitement channel into his small hands. He leaned back, ready to swing higher, ready to touch the sky. Creak! Snap! The sound was utterly discordant, a metallic shriek that sliced through the droning of the cicadas and the chatter of the children. It was the unmistakable sound of structural failure. Izuku didn't register the fall at first. He only felt a sudden, disorienting loss of gravity. The world tilted sideways. He hit the rubber matting back first, a soft oomph escaping his lungs. He wasn't hurt. Strangely, the impact felt like nothing more than landing on a pile of soft pillows, but he was confused. The playground went dead silent. Izuku blinked, looking up at the sky. Then, he looked down at his hands. His small, chubby toddler fingers were still wrapped tightly around the swing's chain. But the chain was no longer attached to the heavy crossbar above. Looking closer, Izuku realized the thick steel carabiner and the heavy-duty bracket that secured the chain to the frame hadn't just broken, they had been mangled. The metal was twisted and deformed, torn apart as if it were made of cheap aluminum foil. He hadn't just broken the swing. He had gripped the steel so hard he crushed the links, and then pulled with such force that he tore the reinforced mounting bracket straight out of the welded steel crossbar. Katsuki stared down from the jungle gym, the popping in his palms ceasing entirely. His crimson eyes were wide, fixed on the thick chunk of ripped steel still clutched in Izuku's small fist. "Deku," Katsuki whispered, the bravado suddenly absent from his voice. "What did you just do?" Izuku sat up, dropping the heavy chain. It hit the rubber matting with a dull, heavy thud. He looked at his hands, then at the broken swing, and then at the terrified faces of the other children. He didn't feel any different. He hadn't tried to break it. He was just happy. He just squeezed. I think, Izuku stammered, his bottom lip trembling as he realized he had destroyed public property. "I think I got my quirk." The waiting room of Dr. Tsubasa's clinic smelled strongly of antiseptic, and old magazines. Izuku sat beside his mother, swinging his legs back and forth, staring at the cartoon frogs painted on the wall. He was acutely aware of his mother's nervous energy. Inko Midoriya was a worrier by nature, and the call from the playground supervisor had sent her into a mild panic. She held Izuku's right hand in both of hers, her thumb anxiously rubbing across his knuckles. Izuku noticed, for the first time, how fragile her hands felt. Like little bird wings. He kept his own hand entirely limp, terrified that if he squeezed back, he might break her, just like the swing. "Midoriya?" called a nurse, popping her head out from a door down the hall. Inko jumped, gathering her purse. "Yes. That's us. Come on, Izuku." They were ushered into a sterile examination room. A few minutes later, Dr. Tsubasa waddled in. He was a short, rotund man with a thick, bushy mustache and a pair of round spectacles that made his eyes look unnaturally large. He carried a manila folder and a series of X-ray films, humming a thoughtful, slightly disconcerting tune. Well, Dr. Tsubasa said, slapping the X-rays onto the light board mounted on the wall. He turned on the backlight. "Mrs. Midoriya. Little Izuku. We have some incredibly fascinating results here. Is he okay, doctor?" Inko asked, her voice tight. "When they told me he tore a swing set apart, I couldn't believe it. Izuku is so small. Did he hurt himself? Are his bones okay?" Dr. Tsubasa chuckled, a rumbling sound deep in his chest. "Hurt himself? Mrs. Midoriya, I highly doubt your son could hurt himself if he threw himself off the roof of this building." Inko gasped, horrified. "Doctor, a joke. But only slightly," the doctor amended, tapping the X-ray on the board. The film showed the skeletal structure of Izuku's right arm. But it looked wrong. The bones weren't the ghostly, semi-translucent white typical of an X-ray. They were stark, opaque, and blindingly bright white, completely blocking the machine's radiation. "Look at this," Dr. Tsubasa said, tracing the bone. "We had to run the X-ray machine at the absolute maximum radiation yield just to get an image, and even then, we can barely see the marrow. And the muscle tissue surrounding it? It's just as fascinating." Izuku stared at the picture of his arm. It looked cool, like a robot's arm inside a comic book. "Izuku has manifested a mutant class quirk," Dr. Tsubasa explained, turning his chair to face Inko. "I'm calling it Titan Dense for now, unless you prefer another name. His entire physical structure, muscle fibers, bone density, tendons, ligaments, and even his epidermis, is fundamentally altered on a cellular level." "Altered how?" Inko asked, leaning forward. "He is dense, Mrs. Midoriya." "Incredibly so," the doctor said, his eyes gleaming with scientific curiosity. "A normal human muscle fiber is like a single thread of cotton. Izuku's muscle fibers are like braided steel cables. They are packed together so tightly, and are so inherently resilient, that his baseline physical strength, durability, and weight are entirely off the charts for a normal human being. He doesn't need to activate this power like an emitter quirk. It's just the way his body is built." Inko looked at her son, her eyes wide. "So, he's super strong?" "Super strong is a drastic understatement," Dr. Tsubasa corrected. "The swing set incident? That was a fraction of what he's capable of. The human body naturally limits its strength to prevent muscles from tearing away from the bone. Izuku's body doesn't have that problem. His bones are thick enough to support virtually any muscular output. As he grows, as he builds more muscle mass, frankly, I shudder to think of his upper limits." Izuku's eyes sparkled. "Super strong. Like All Might. He could save people from fires, lift cars off trapped civilians, and punch villains right into the sky." But Dr. Tsubasa's voice grew serious, dropping an octave. The sparkle in Izuku's eyes dimmed slightly at the tone. "There is a severe drawback, Mrs. Midoriya." Inko's hands flew to her mouth. "What is it?" "Control," the doctor said simply. "Imagine living your entire life surrounded by wet tissue paper. That is how the world will feel to Izuku. Right now, he is 4 years old, and he accidentally tore through reinforced playground steel because he got a little excited. What happens when he gets angry? What happens when he wants to hug a friend, or pet a dog, or hold a baby?" The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Izuku looked down at his small hands. They didn't look like braided steel cables. They just looked like a kid's hands. But the memory of the heavy steel chain twisting like putty in his grip flashed through his mind. Izuku, Dr. Tsubasa said, kneeling down so he was eye level with the boy. You have a very, very powerful quirk. A hero's quirk, no doubt about it. But with that kind of power comes a very difficult responsibility. You have to be careful. More careful than anyone else in the world. If you push a door, you have to push it gently, or you'll rip it off its hinges. If you shake someone's hand, you have to hold back 99% of your strength, or you will shatter every bone in their fingers. Do you understand? Izuku swallowed hard. The excitement in his chest curdled into a cold, heavy knot of anxiety. He looked at his mother. She was staring at him not with pride, but with a creeping, undeniable terror. Not terror of him, but terror for him. And terror of what he could accidentally do. Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. I don't want to hurt anyone. I know you don't, my boy, the doctor sighed, patting Izuku on the knee. He meant it to be comforting, but Izuku flinched, hypersensitive to the interaction. It will take time. You'll need specialized training to learn how to limit your output. Until then, you must treat everything around you as if it were made of glass. On the train ride home, Izuku sat perfectly still. He didn't kick his legs. He didn't press his face against the window to watch the city go by. He kept his hands folded neatly in his lap, his knuckles white. Inko watched him, her heart breaking. She wanted to reach out and pull him into a tight, comforting embrace, but she hesitated. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. Like wet tissue paper, Izuku noticed her hesitation. He saw the way her hand twitched toward him, and then pulled back. It was a tiny gesture, but it broke something inside the 4-year-old boy. He wasn't just a hero in the making anymore. He was a hazard. The next 8 years were a master class in hypervigilance and self-restraint. While other children ran wildly through the halls of elementary school, slamming lockers and tackling each other in the dirt, Izuku moved like a ghost. A very slow, very methodical ghost. The learning curve was steep and littered with casualties. By the time he was 7, Izuku had gone through 42 different backpacks. If he pulled the straps in a hurry, they tore clean off. He broke dozens of pencils a week, snapping the wood between his thumb and forefinger just by trying to write his name. His mother had to replace all the doorknobs in their apartment with custom-forged solid brass, because Izuku kept accidentally crushing the hollow aluminum ones when he was tired or distracted. The worst incident, the one that scarred Izuku's psyche the deepest, happened when he was 8. It was his birthday, and his father, Hisashi, had mailed him a limited edition Silver Age All Might action figure from America. It was beautiful, articulated in 20 different places, with a shiny metallic paint job. Izuku was ecstatic. He had gasped, pulled the figure from the box, and pressed it to his chest in a hug of pure, unadulterated joy. He heard the crunch before he felt it. When he pulled the figure away, the plastic torso had completely caved in. The arms were snapped off at the joints, and the head was crushed flat. He had destroyed his most prized possession in less than 3 seconds just by hugging it too hard. Izuku hadn't cried. He just stared at the broken plastic in his hands, terrified. What if that had been his mother? What if that had been a friend? From that day on, Izuku Midoriya changed. The bright, bouncy, enthusiastic fanboy who wanted to shout his love for heroes from the rooftops was forced to retreat inward. He locked his physical body down, sealing his raw, catastrophic power behind a mental fortress of anxiety, calculation, and extreme caution. He developed a slouch, hunching his shoulders to make himself look smaller, less intimidating. He learned to keep his hands buried deep in his pockets, away from fragile things like glass, wood, and people. He began to mutter constantly, a coping mechanism to keep his brain moving faster than his body. If his mind was occupied analyzing the structural integrity of a bridge or the physics of a pro-hero's quirk, he wouldn't accidentally put a foot through the floorboards. Despite his terrifying strength, his personality remained distinctly Izuku, timid, nerdy, incredibly empathetic, and fiercely intelligent. He didn't want to conquer the world. He just wanted to survive it without breaking it. He became a gentle giant. Although he wasn't overly tall for his age, his physique was noticeably different. By the time he was 10, he looked like a miniature bodybuilder. Beneath his baggy school uniforms, his muscles were dense, thick, and packed with an unnatural heaviness. He weighed nearly twice as much as a normal kid his size, his bones heavy and thick. His footsteps were naturally loud, so he trained himself to walk on the balls of his feet, adopting a strange, gliding gait to mask his weight. At school, the other kids learned quickly to give him a wide berth. Not because they hated him, but because of the rumors. Midori is the kid who accidentally crushed a bowling ball with one hand on a field trip. Midori is the kid who sneezed and cracked the blackboard. He was an anomaly. A freak of nature. But there was one person who didn't fear him. One person who saw Izuku's terrifying, passive power not as a hazard, but as a personal insult. Katsuki Bakugo. Their dynamic had shifted drastically since the playground incident. Katsuki's quirk, Explosion, was incredibly powerful, flashy, and versatile. He was praised endlessly by teachers, peers, and parents. He was the golden child, destined for UA High and the top 10 hero billboards. But Katsuki was smart. A prodigy in his own right. And every time he looked at Izuku, he saw the truth that no one else wanted to admit. It didn't matter how big Katsuki's explosions got. It didn't matter how fast he could move or how loud he could scream. Izuku was fundamentally, biologically, inarguably stronger than him. And that drove Katsuki absolutely insane. It came to a boiling point during the spring of their 5th year in elementary school. They were 10 years old. A group of boys had been playing kickball in the park near the woods. Katsuki was pitching. Izuku was sitting on a park bench, meticulously taking notes in a heavily reinforced notebook with a specially made titanium-barreled pen his mother had saved up to buy him. One of Katsuki's lackeys, a boy with elongated, bat-like wings, had kicked the ball out of bounds. It rolled directly toward Izuku, bumping softly against his sneaker. "Hey, Deku!" Katsuki barked, storming over, the usual entourage of lackeys trailing behind him like pilot fish. "Kick it back!" Izuku looked up, blinking behind the messy mop of green curls that fell into his eyes. He looked at the red rubber ball, then back at Katsuki. I shouldn't, Kaken," Izuku said softly, his voice carrying that familiar, timid tremble. "What, you think you're too good to play with us?" Katsuki sneered, slamming a fist into his palm, producing a sharp crack of a spark. "Or are you just scared you'll trip over your own heavy feet?" "No, it's not that," Izuku said, waving his hands defensively in front of him, careful not to move them too fast. The air pressure from a rapid wave could knock the leaves off the nearby trees. I don't want to pop the ball. It's the only one you guys have." Katsuki's eye twitched. The implication, that Izuku possessed a power so vast and uncontrollable that even kicking a ball was beneath him, tore through Katsuki's fragile, ego-driven worldview like a chainsaw. He didn't see Izuku's genuine anxiety. He saw mockery. He saw condescension from a boy who refused to even try. "You think I care about a stupid ball?" Katsuki roared. The smell of burnt sugar intensified as sweat pooled in his palms. "I'm sick of you acting like you're better than everyone. Always holding back. Always tiptoeing around like we're made of glass. Look at me when I'm talking to you, Deku." Izuku shrank back against the bench, the wood creaking ominously under his sudden shift in weight. "Kaken, please. I'm not acting like I'm better. I'm just trying not to cause trouble." "Trouble?" Katsuki lunged forward, grabbing Izuku by the collar of his school shirt. The reaction from Izuku was instantaneous, deeply ingrained by years of panic. He didn't fight back. He didn't grab Katsuki's wrists. If he did, even in self-defense, he might snap Katsuki's forearms like dry twigs. Instead, Izuku went entirely limp. He braced his core, tensed his immensely dense muscles, and closed his eyes, preparing to weather the storm. Katsuki saw the surrender, and it infuriated him further. He didn't want submission. He wanted a fight. He wanted to prove that his explosions could break the unbreakable boy. "Fight back!" Katsuki screamed. He let go of Izuku's collar, drew his right arm back, and unleashed a point-blank explosion directly into Izuku's chest. Boom! The shockwave rattled the park benches. The other kids shrieked and scrambled backward as a cloud of black smoke and orange flame engulfed the space where Izuku was sitting. "Bakugo, are you crazy?" one of the winged boy cried out, coughing from the smoke. "You could have killed him!" Katsuki stood there, panting, his hands smoking. A feral, desperate grin stretched across his face. He finally did it. He finally proved he was stronger, but as the smoke slowly cleared, carried away by the gentle spring breeze, the grin on Katsuki's face melted into a mask of utter horror. Izuku was still sitting on the bench. The front of his school uniform was entirely incinerated, reduced to blackened, smoldering rags that hung loosely from his shoulders. The wooden slats of the bench beneath him were charred and splintered from the blast radius. But Izuku himself? He was completely unharmed. His bare chest, heavily muscled and corded with thick, dense tissue, didn't even have a red mark on it. Not a blister. Not a scratch. The explosion, hot enough to melt plastic and shatter rock, had washed over Izuku's skin like a warm summer breeze. Izuku opened his eyes slowly, looking down at his ruined shirt. He let out a long, trembling sigh, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. Not from pain, but from the immense stress of the situation. "My mom just bought this shirt, Kaken," Izuku said, his voice thick with genuine sorrow. He didn't look angry. He didn't look boastful. He just looked incredibly sad and exhausted. Katsuki took a step back, his hands trembling. He stared at Izuku's pristine skin, then at his own palms. The reality of the power gap slammed into him with the force of a freight train. He had used his strongest blast, a blast that would have hospitalized a normal adult. And Deku hadn't even flinched. Deku was crying about a shirt. It was a profound, ego-shattering humiliation. "You!" Katsuki stammered, his voice cracking. He pointed a shaking finger at Izuku. "You're a monster. You hear me, Deku? You're a freaking freak." Katsuki turned and sprinted away, leaving his lackeys behind. He ran until his lungs burned, trying to outrun the image of the unmovable boy on the bench. He couldn't beat him. Not yet, but from that day forward, Katsuki Bakugo's entire worldview shifted. Izuku Midoriya was no longer just a childhood friend or a weakling to be bullied. Izuku Midoriya was the wall that Katsuki had to climb. The titan he had to slay to prove he was the best. The rivalry ceased to be about bullying. It became a desperate, aggressive, one-sided arms race. Back at the park, Izuku sat alone on the ruined bench. He carefully picked up his titanium pen, making sure not to squeeze it too hard, and opened his notebook. With methodical, painfully slow movements, he began to sketch the blast radius of Kaken's explosion, taking notes on the heat output. He didn't want to be a monster. He just wanted to be a hero. 4 years later, Aldera Junior High was an ordinary public school, typical in every way except for the fact that its third-year class housed 2 of the most statistically anomalous students in the prefecture. The morning bell rang, echoing down the scuffed linoleum hallways. Students flooded through the doors, a sea of black Gakurin uniforms and idle chatter. But as they neared classroom 3A, a strange phenomenon occurred. The sea of students naturally parted, leaving a wide, empty lane down the center of the hallway. Walking down that empty lane was Izuku Midoriya. At 14, Izuku was an imposing figure, though he did everything in his power to hide it. He stood at an average height, but his shoulders were impossibly broad, straining the seams of his custom-tailored, reinforced uniform. His neck was thick, his jawline sharp, and every movement he made was executed with a deliberate, agonizing slowness that spoke of unimaginable restrained power. He walked on the balls of his feet, his thick rubber-soled shoes barely making a sound, a stark contrast to the heavy, dense mass of his body. He kept his head down, his eyes glued to the open notebook in his hands. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. He was currently muttering up a storm, dissecting the debut of the new heroine, Empty Lady. Gigantification quirks inherently trade off kinetic density for sheer mass, meaning her bone structure must become increasingly porous to support the square-cube law of her enlarged volume, which leaves her highly susceptible to localized, high-impact blunt force trauma to the joints. Morning Midoriya, a brave student squeaked as he passed by. Izuku stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly closed his notebook, turned his head with measured precision, and offered the student a blindingly bright, incredibly gentle smile. "Good morning, Tanaka-kun," Izuku replied, his voice soft and polite. "Did you finish the math homework?" "Why, yeah. See ya." Tanaka hurried away, sweating slightly. Izuku sighed internally. He knew he intimidated them. Despite 14 years of practice, despite never once raising his voice or fighting back, his sheer presence was suffocating. He was a tiger walking among kittens, pretending to be a house cat. It was exhausting. He entered classroom 3A and carefully navigated the narrow aisles. His desk was located at the very back of the room. It was not a standard-issue wooden desk. After Izuku had accidentally crushed 3 desks into splinters simply by leaning his elbows on them during his first year, the school board had commissioned a specialized desk made of thick, industrial-grade steel. It looked like a workbench from a machine shop, bolted directly to the concrete floor. Izuku sat down with a soft exhale. He reached into his reinforced canvas bag and pulled out a pencil. It wasn't a normal wooden pencil. It was a solid cylinder of brushed aluminum, roughly the thickness of a thick marker, with a heavy-duty graphite core running down the center. Standard pencils crumbled to dust in his grip. He began to write, his grip terrifyingly delicate, barely letting the metal touch his skin. A few minutes later, the classroom door slid open with a violent bang. Katsuki Bakugo strolled in, his uniform unbuttoned, his tie loose, exuding an aura of hostile superiority. He kicked a chair out of his way, ignored the teacher standing at the podium, and locked eyes with Izuku at the back of the room. Izuku paused his writing, looking up. Katsuki didn't sneer. He didn't hurl an insult. He simply raised his right hand, curled it into a fist, and ignited a spark that flashed as bright as a miniature sun. It was a silent challenge. A promise. I'm getting stronger. I'm going to blow you away. Izuku blinked his large, green eyes. He offered Katsuki a small, polite nod, and went back to his notebook. Katsuki's eye twitched violently. "TCH. Smug bastard," he muttered, throwing himself into his desk. The homeroom teacher, a thin man who looked chronically exhausted, cleared his throat and tapped a stack of papers on his podium. "All right, settle down," the teacher said. "Since you're all third years, it's time for you to think seriously about your futures. I'll be passing out printouts for your desired career paths." The teacher paused, looking over the class. Then, with a dramatic sigh, he tossed the stack of papers over his shoulder. They scattered into the air like snow. "But who am I kidding? You all want to go to the hero course, right?" The classroom erupted. Corks flashed, popped, and transformed. Kids with glowing skin, stretchy limbs, and floating objects cheered in unison. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks," the teacher yelled over the din. "But remember, using your powers during school is against the rules. Sensei, don't lump me in with these background characters." Katsuki's voice cut through the noise like a knife. He was leaning back in his chair, his feet propped up on his desk, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "I'm not going to be stuck at the bottom of the barrel with these losers. I'm the real deal." The class turned on him instantly. "Hey, what's that supposed to mean, Bakugo? Get over yourself. Bring it on, extras!" Katsuki roared, small explosions popping in his palms. "I aced all the mock tests. I'm the only one here with the stuff for UA High. I'm gonna surpass All Might and become the top hero, and I'll be the richest, most famous guy in the world." "Oh, right," the teacher said, glancing at a clipboard. "Bakugo, you're aiming for UA High, aren't you?" The class fell silent. UA High was the National Academy. The acceptance rate was abysmally low. It was a pipe dream for 99% of the population. Katsuki stood up, basking in the shocked silence. "That's right. I'm gonna be the first from this crappy public school to get in. I'm gonna carve my name into history." "Midoriya," the teacher added casually, completely ruining Katsuki's momentum. "You're also applying for UA, aren't you?" The classroom didn't erupt into laughter. In any other universe, a quirkless, timid boy applying for UA would be the punchline of the decade. But in this universe, the reaction was dead silence. Everyone turned slowly to look at the back of the room. Izuku was frozen, his aluminum pencil hovering a millimeter above his notebook. He felt 30 pairs of eyes on him. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. They weren't laughing. They were terrified. And Midoriya? A student whispered. He's going to UA? God, imagine him in the physical exam. Another muttered, visibly paling. He's going to accidentally kill someone. I heard he benchmarked his grip strength at the hospital last year and broke the hydraulic machine. I heard he doesn't even need to use his arms to fight. He can just sneeze and blow away a villain. Izuku felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He hated this. He hated being viewed as a weapon of mass destruction. He hunched his broad shoulders forward, trying desperately to shrink, to make himself look harmless. Izuku stammered, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I want to be a hero who saves people. With a smile. Like All Might. I know it's a hard school to get into, but I want to try. Smash! Katsuki's palms slammed down onto Izuku's steel desk, generating an explosion so violent it blew the windows of the classroom open, sending papers flying into the hallway. Smoke filled the back of the room. When the smoke cleared, Katsuki was leaning over the desk, his face inches from Izuku's. The steel desk beneath Katsuki's smoking hand was blackened, but utterly unyielding. Listen to me, Deku, Katsuki snarled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage and desperate insecurity. You think you can just waltz into UA and take the top spot from me? You think just because you're a walking tank, you're better than me? Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't lean back. He just looked at Katsuki, his green eyes calm and deeply sorrowful. I don't think I'm better than you, Kaken, Izuku said quietly. Your quirk is amazing. You're smart, and you're fast, and you have the drive of a true hero. Then stop looking down on me. Katsuki yelled, grabbing Izuku by the lapels of his uniform. Izuku's hands twitched. His instincts, buried beneath 14 years of psychological conditioning, urged him to grab Katsuki's wrists and pry them off. It would take a fraction of a second. It would require perhaps 0.1% of his raw strength. But he didn't move his hands. He knew that if he miscalculated his grip by even a millimeter, he would crush Katsuki's radius and ulna into powder. Instead, Izuku simply let Katsuki hold him. I'm not looking down on you, Izuku said, his voice steady. But I'm not going to stop walking my path, Kaken. I want to save people. And I'm going to use my power to do it. Safely. I'm going to UA. Katsuki stared into Izuku's eyes. He saw no fear, no mockery, and no anger. He saw only an unmovable, unbreakable wall of resolve. It made Katsuki sick to his stomach. He shoved Izuku backward, though Izuku didn't move an inch, and clicked his tongue. We'll see about that, Deku, Katsuki spat, turning on his heel. The entrance exam isn't just about who can punch the hardest. I'll show you what a real hero looks like. As Katsuki stomped back to his seat, the classroom remained deathly quiet. Izuku slowly picked up his aluminum pencil. He smoothed out the singed page of his notebook with a terrifyingly delicate brush of his fingers. He looked out the window, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. He didn't want to fight Kaken. He didn't want to fight anyone, really. Fighting meant unleashing the beast that lived in his muscles and his bones. Fighting meant collateral damage. Fighting meant breaking things. But out there, in the real world, villains were hurting people. The weak were being preyed upon. And Izuku Midoriya, the boy who lived in a world made of wet tissue paper, knew he had a responsibility. If I have to break myself out of this glass house to save them, Izuku thought, tightening his grip on his metal pencil just enough to leave a microscopic indentation in the aluminum, then I will. The bell for the end of homeroom rang. Izuku carefully stood up, slung his reinforced canvas bag over his broad shoulder, and began the slow, heavy walk to his next class. He was the boy made of iron. And he was going to UA High, even if he had to tiptoe the entire way there. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue over the city of Muzurifu, stretching the shadows of the utility poles across the pavement. School was finally out. For most students, this was a time of liberation, a chance to run to the arcades, hang out at karaoke booths, or chase each other down the streets. For 14-year-old Izuku Midoriya, it was just another exercise in meticulous, exhausting restraint. He walked home alone, his heavy, custom-reinforced canvas bag slung over his broad shoulder. With every step, he performed a complex, subconscious calculus. He analyzed the angle of his footfall, the distribution of his unnaturally dense weight, and the kinetic force required to propel himself forward without cracking the concrete sidewalk. To an observer, Izuku simply walked with a strangely smooth, gliding gait, rolling from heel to toe with extreme deliberate care. He looked like a muscular, oversized teenager trying not to wake a sleeping dog. His mind, however, was racing. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13 was safely tucked in his bag, its titanium covers shielding the delicate paper within. But his thoughts weren't on Empty Lady's debut anymore. They were stuck on Kaken's explosive outburst in the classroom. "You think just because you're a walking tank, you're better than me?" Izuku sighed, a soft puff of air that rustled his messy green curls. He didn't think he was better than Katsuki. In many ways, he envied his childhood friend. Katsuki's explosion quirk was powerful, yes, but it was expressive. Katsuki could control the yield, the direction, the concussive force. He could use it to maneuver in midair, to blind opponents, to deliver precise strikes. Izuku's quirk, tight and dense, offered no such versatility. It was a blunt, terrifying instrument. It was a sledgehammer in a world built of spun glass. The doctors had told his mother that his muscle fibers were braided like industrial steel cables, his bones essentially solid pillars of calcium and unknown organic compounds that rendered them practically indestructible. He was a biological fortress. But a fortress couldn't reach out and gently hold a crying child. A fortress couldn't pet a stray cat without risking breaking its spine. As Izuku walked beneath a large overpass, the shadows swallowed the golden sunlight. He liked the quiet of this route. It gave him a moment to breathe, to let his guard down just a fraction of a percent. He let his shoulders slump, dropping the tense, high-strung posture he maintained at school. A sudden, vile smell hit his nose. It was a putrid mixture of raw sewage, stagnant river water, and rotting garbage. Izuku stopped. His thick, heavy boots halted silently on the asphalt. He turned his head just in time to hear a disgusting, wet squelching sound emerging from a nearby manhole cover. A medium-sized meat suit, a gurgling, distorted voice hissed from the darkness. "A bit wide in the shoulders, but you'll do nicely to help me hide." A massive, undulating wave of dark green, viscous sludge erupted from the sewer grate. It was a fluid mass, bubbling with toxic gases, with two bulbous, manic eyes floating near the top and a jagged set of human-like teeth smiling a horrific grin. Before Izuku could react, the sludge villain lunged. The fluid mass crashed over him, wrapping around his torso, his arms, and surging up toward his face. "Don't worry, kid," the villain chuckled, the sound vibrating through the muck. "It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. Then, it'll all be over." The sludge forced its way toward Izuku's mouth and nose, attempting to plunge down his trachea to asphyxiate him from the inside out. Panic, raw and electric, spiked in Izuku's chest. He couldn't breathe. The stench was overwhelming. Instinct took over, but Izuku's instincts were different from a normal person's. Where a normal teenager would thrash and flail, Izuku's body naturally clamped down into an impenetrable defensive state. His jaw snapped shut with the force of a hydraulic press. His lips sealed tightly. His neck muscles, thick and corded, bulged outward, hardening into something resembling solid granite. The sludge villain tried to force his fluid body into Izuku's mouth, but it was like trying to pry open a bank vault with a wet noodle. "What the?" the villain gurgled in confusion. "Open your damn mouth. Why is your face so hard?" Izuku's eyes were wide. He was holding his breath, but he knew he couldn't hold it forever. He raised his hands, bringing his incredibly dense, heavy fingers up to his face. He grabbed handfuls of the sludge. It felt like thick, oily mud. "I need to pull him off," Izuku thought, his mind racing. "But if I pull too hard, I might compress his fluid body and rupture his organs, assuming he has a central nervous system hidden in the liquid. If I swing him, the centrifugal force will destroy the pillars of the overpass." Even while suffocating, Izuku was paralyzed by the fear of his own power. He squeezed the sludge, trying to find a middle ground between gentle push and lethal force. The villain shrieked as Izuku's fingers inadvertently compacted the fluid to the density of hard rubber, causing immense pain, but not enough to dislodge the massive bulk of the creature. Izuku's lungs began to burn. His vision blurred at the edges. Was this it? Was he going to die because he was too afraid to fight back? Suddenly, the manhole cover rattled again. A massive, towering figure burst from the subterranean darkness, landing on the pavement with a heavy, authoritative thud that made the ground tremble. "Fear not, young man," a voice boomed. It was a voice Izuku had heard 1,000 times on his computer screen, a voice that resonated with pure, unadulterated hope. "I am here." Through his blurring vision, Izuku saw the golden hair, the towering, muscular physique, the brilliant, fearless smile. All Might. The #1 hero, Texas. Smash! All Might threw a right hook. He didn't even make contact with the villain. The sheer, overwhelming air pressure generated by the speed and power of the punch hit the sludge villain like a localized hurricane. The sludge was instantly blown apart, scattering into thousands of harmless, glopping droplets against the concrete walls of the overpass. The force of the wind hit Izuku squarely in the chest. A normal person would have been blown backward, sent tumbling down the street. Izuku, however, barely shifted his weight. His heavy, dense frame absorbed the gale-force winds, his school uniform whipping violently around his body. He gasped for air, falling to his knees. Well, that was a close call. All Might boomed, quickly producing 2 empty 2-liter soda bottles from his pockets, and rapidly scooping up the scattered pieces of the unconscious villain. "Apologies for getting you involved in my justice fighting, young man. But thanks to you, I was able to capture him." Izuku coughed, rubbing his throat. He looked up, his emerald eyes wide with absolute, starstruck awe. It was him. The symbol of peace. Standing right in front of him. Izuku scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sludge on his uniform. All Might. I need an autograph. Please. My notebook." He quickly reached into his bag, pulling out the titanium-covered notebook and his aluminum pencil. He opened it, only to find that All Might had already signed a 2-page spread in massive, bold strokes. "Already done." All Might laughed, striking a heroic pose, the bottles of sludge safely tucked into the massive pockets of his cargo pants. "Now, I must be off. Pro-heroes are constantly fighting time as well as evil." All Might turned, bending his knees to prepare for a massive leap. "Wait!" Izuku called out. I have a question. Something I need to ask you." "No time for questions. Stay safe, citizen." All Might sprang into the air, ascending toward the sky like a rocket. Izuku watched him go, a profound sense of desperation washing over him. This was his only chance. He needed to know if someone with a quirk that only destroyed could ever learn to save. He couldn't let All Might leave. Without thinking, Izuku moved. He didn't use full power. He barely used 5% of his leg strength. He bent his knees, bracing his heavy frame, and pushed off the ground. Crack! The concrete sidewalk beneath Izuku's feet shattered, a spiderweb of deep fissures spreading out for 10 feet in every direction. The kinetic recoil launched Izuku into the air, his dense body cutting through the wind like a cannonball. He didn't grab All Might's leg. Izuku knew that if he grabbed a moving object, his sheer density and weight would act like a massive anchor, potentially ripping All Might's leg out of its socket, or causing them both to plummet from the sky. Instead, Izuku simply matched All Might's trajectory. He soared through the air, the wind roaring in his ears, and overtook the #1 hero in mid-flight. All Might, currently hundreds of feet in the air, looked to his left and saw a heavily muscled middle schooler casually flying parallel to him. The hero's eyes bugged out of his head. "What the?" All Might choked out, violently coughing, a sudden spray of blood escaping his lips. Izuku realized he was falling faster than All Might. He spotted a flat rooftop on a nearby commercial building. He shifted his center of gravity, falling like a lead weight. He landed on the roof with a deafening thud. The reinforced concrete of the roof groaned, a small crater forming beneath his heavy boots, dust billowing outward. A second later, All Might landed beside him, skidding slightly. He was gripping his side, panting heavily. The bottles in his pockets jostled violently. "Young man!" All Might gasped, trying to maintain his booming voice. "What were you thinking?" You have an incredible leaping quirk, but that was highly dangerous. I am sorry. Izuku bowed, his hands firmly pressed against his thighs. I didn't mean to startle you. I didn't grab you because I knew I was too heavy, but I had to follow you. I have to know. Izuku stood up straight, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He looked the symbol of peace dead in the eye, his heart hammering against his incredibly thick ribs. My quirk it's a hazard, Izuku said, his voice trembling, not from fear, but from years of pent-up anxiety. I'm so strong that everything I touch feels like wet tissue paper. I've spent my whole life terrified of my own body. I'm afraid that if I try to fight villains, I'll just end up destroying the city and hurting the people I'm trying to save. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, bowing his head. Even with a power that only knows how to break things, can someone like me become a hero who saves people with a smile? Like you? Silence fell over the rooftop. Only the howling of the wind answered him. When Izuku finally opened his eyes, expecting to see the towering, reassuring smile of his idol, he gasped. The massive, muscle-bound hero was gone. In his place stood a skeletal, emaciated man with sunken eyes, shaggy blonde hair, and clothes that hung off his frail frame like a scarecrow. The man was coughing up blood, wiping his chin with a bony hand. "Eh, fake?" Izuku shrieked, taking a panicked step back. "I assure you, kid. I am All Might," the skeletal man groaned, sitting down heavily against the rooftop's AC unit. "You know how guys at the pool suck in their gut to look tough? It's like that." Izuku's encyclopedic mind short-circuited. "But how? You're the symbol of peace. You're invincible." All Might let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. He slowly pulled up his oversized white t-shirt, revealing a horrific, jagged scar that covered the entire left side of his chest. It looked like a crater, a massive chunk of his respiratory system utterly obliterated. 5 years ago, All Might said, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual bombast. An enemy did this to me. My respiratory system was nearly destroyed. I lost my whole stomach. I've gone through repeated surgeries, but I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. Izuku stared, horrified. 5 years ago, was it the fight with Toxic Chainsaw? You know your stuff, All Might noted, offering a weak smile. But no. That punk couldn't scratch me. I kept this fight under wraps. The symbol of peace cannot be seen as vulnerable. All Might sighed, looking out over the sprawling city. You asked me if someone with a destructive, uncontrollable power can be a hero, All Might said, his tone turning deadly serious. You're clearly strong, kid. That jump proved it. You've got raw power in spades. But power without control isn't heroism. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Izuku felt a cold weight drop in his stomach. Pro-heroes have to be surgical, All Might continued, gesturing to the city below. If a villain is holding hostages in a building, you can't just knock the building down to get to them. If you're terrified of your own strength, if you think you're a hazard, then you're a liability on the battlefield. Hesitation gets people killed. Lack of control gets people killed. The words cut through Izuku like a physical blade. It was everything he had feared, everything he had told himself in the dark of his room, confirmed by the number one hero himself. I'm not telling you to give up, young man, All Might said softly, seeing the devastation on Izuku's face. There are other ways to help people. Become a police officer. A firefighter. A rescue worker in uninhabited disaster zones. But to be a frontline pro-hero, you have to master yourself before you can save others. If you can't do that, you should reconsider your path. All Might stood up, heavily leaning on the handrail of the stairs leading down into the building. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get this sludge villain to the authorities. I'm out of time. All Might disappeared down the stairwell, leaving Izuku alone on the roof. Izuku stood there for a long time, staring at his hands. Thick, heavily calloused, and capable of crushing diamonds. A liability. A disaster. He closed his hands into fists, and let out a shaky breath. He's right, Izuku thought, a profound sadness settling over him. I'm too dangerous. Kaken was right. I should just stay out of the way. Izuku took the long way down from the roof, taking the stairs slowly, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stairwell. By the time he reached the street level, the afternoon sky had turned a hazy, chaotic orange stained with the thick, black smoke of a fire. He heard the explosions before he saw the flames. Deep, concussive thumps that rattled the glass in the storefronts. They sounded familiar. Too familiar. Izuku's feet moved before his brain could process it. He hurried down the street, turning the corner into the Tatooine shopping district. The scene was pure pandemonium. An entire city block was engulfed in flames. Several buildings were heavily damaged, their facades blown apart by massive explosions. Sirens wailed, and a massive crowd of civilians was being held back by a thin line of police officers. Standing in the center of the chaos, towering above the flames, was the sludge villain. Izuku's breath hitched. How? All Might had him. Then, the memory flashed in his mind. The leap. He had startled All Might in midair. The hero had dropped the bottles. This is my fault. Izuku pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his dense mass easily parting the sea of onlookers. He looked at the pro-heroes on the scene. Death Arms, a hero with incredible physical strength, was clutching a bruised shoulder, completely helpless against the fluid villain. Kamui Woods was retreating, his wooden limbs highly susceptible to the roaring fires. Empty Lady was stuck at the entrance of the narrow street, complaining that she needed a two-lane road to use her gigantification quirk. We can't do anything. Death Arms shouted in frustration. None of our quirks are suited for this. We have to wait for someone with a favorable quirk to arrive. But the hostage, Kamui Woods yelled. He's not going to last much longer. Izuku's eyes snapped to the center of the sludge mass. Trapped within the swirling, bubbling green muck was a boy. He was thrashing violently, unleashing massive, desperate explosions from his palms in a futile attempt to blast the sludge away. The explosions only fed the fires around them. The boy turned his head, gasping for a breath of clean air, his crimson eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. It was Katsuki. Izuku's heart stopped. His childhood friend, his rival, the boy who promised to surpass All Might, was suffocating. And the heroes were just standing there. Waiting. He's going to die, Izuku realized, his analytical mind processing the oxygen deprivation, the heat, the smoke. He has maybe 2 minutes. You're a liability on the battlefield. All Might's words echoed in his head. I'm gonna carve my name into history. Katsuki's words fought back. Izuku didn't make a conscious decision to move. He didn't weigh the pros and cons. He didn't think about his weight, his density, or his paralyzing fear of collateral damage. He just saw his friend crying for help. Izuku ducked under the police tape and burst out into the clearing. Hey! Kid, get back here! Death Arms roared, reaching out and clamping a massive hand down onto Izuku's shoulder to stop him. The pro-hero expected to easily yank the teenager backward. Instead, when Death Arms pulled, his arm violently jerked, a sharp pop echoing from his shoulder joint as he tried to move a boy who weighed entirely too much and possessed kinetic resistance far beyond human limits. Death Arms stumbled forward, crying out in pain, letting go of the immovable boy. Izuku didn't even notice. He was already sprinting. He didn't run lightly. He abandoned his tiptoeing. He engaged the thick, coiled steel cables of his leg muscles. Every step he took hit the asphalt like a mortar shell, cracking the street, kicking up chunks of debris and pavement. The sound of his approach was terrifying, a rhythmic, thunderous booming that shook the surrounding buildings. The sludge villain looked down, its massive, liquid eyes widening. You! The villain gurgled, recognizing the boy whose face was too hard to crush. You want to play hero? I'll crush you! The villain raised a massive whip of solidifying sludge and swung it down at Izuku like a guillotine. Deku! Stay away! Katsuki managed to scream, his voice muffled by the muck. Izuku didn't dodge. He didn't try to block it. He simply lowered his shoulder and charged right through the strike. The sludge whip hit Izuku's shoulder with enough force to shatter a car. Izuku didn't even break stride. The sludge splattered against him, utterly useless against his tight and dense biology. He closed the distance in an instant, leaping into the air. He didn't throw his backpack. He didn't try to distract the villain. Izuku plunged both of his bare hands directly into the thick, swirling mass of the sludge villain's body, aiming for the area right around Katsuki's torso. "Idiot!" The villain laughed, his fluid body bubbling. "I'm liquid. You can't punch water." "I'm not going to punch you," Izuku growled, his voice dropping an octave, his emerald eyes burning with an intensity he had kept buried for 10 long years. "I'm going to pull." Izuku engaged his grip's strength. He didn't hold back. For the first time in his life, he squeezed with everything he had. The physics of the situation changed instantly. Water and sludge are fluid, but under extreme, localized atmospheric pressure, fluid dynamics break down. Izuku squeezed so incredibly hard, applying tens of thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch, that the water molecules within the sludge literally had nowhere to go. He compacted the fluid. The villain's laughter turned into a gurgling shriek of unimaginable agony. The liquid around Izuku's hands solidified into a dense, rock-hard chunk of compressed muck. Izuku planted his heavy boots onto the shattered asphalt, braced his ridiculously dense core, and violently ripped his arms apart. The sound was horrifying. It wasn't a splash. It was the sound of wet clay being torn by heavy machinery. Izuku literally ripped a massive, gaping chasm into the sludge villain's fluid body, tearing the villain in half through sheer, incomprehensible kinetic force. Katsuki, suddenly freed from the suffocating pressure, fell forward, gasping violently for air. Izuku caught him, pulling him close, wrapping his broad, indestructible body around his rival. The sludge villain, half of his mass momentarily blown apart by the cavitation of Izuku's grip, writhed in agony. "You little brat! I'll kill you!" The villain pulled itself back together, forming dozens of sharp, hardened spikes from its remaining mass, hurling them down at the boys like a barrage of spears. At the same time, Katsuki, in a panic, unleashed a massive point-blank explosion right into Izuku's chest, trying to blast the incoming spikes away. Izuku simply took it. He held Katsuki tight, acting as a human shield. The villain's sludge spears shattered harmlessly against Izuku's back, while Katsuki's explosion washed over Izuku's front, merely singing his school uniform. Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't yield a single inch of ground. "I've got him," Izuku thought, his heart racing. "I didn't break him. I controlled it." From the sidelines, a skeletal figure watched the display, his blue eyes wide with shock. Tashinori Yagi, All Might, felt a profound wave of shame wash over him. He, the #1 hero, had stood on the sidelines, crippled by his injury, making excuses about reaching his limit. But this boy, this child who was terrified of his own monstrous strength, who had been told just hours ago that he was a liability, this boy had charged into the flames without a second thought. His heart had moved before his mind could overthink. Tashinori felt the embers of one for all flare violently within his chest. He ignored the agonizing pain in his scar. He ignored the blood rising in his throat. He forced his muscles to expand, his skeletal frame rapidly inflating into the towering, heroic physique of the symbol of peace. If this boy could overcome his deepest fears to save a life, then All Might could push past his limits for one more minute. "I really am pathetic," All Might boomed, a shadow falling over the alleyway as he stepped forward, grabbing the two halves of the reeling sludge villain. Izuku looked up from his protective crouch, his eyes widening. "I told you what makes a champion, yet I didn't put it into practice myself." All Might roared, drawing back his right arm. Blood sprayed from his mouth, but his smile was blinding. Pro heroes are always risking their lives. Detroit. Smash! The punch was catastrophic. The sheer wind pressure generated by the strike didn't just obliterate the sludge villain, it extinguished the fires in the alleyway, shattered the remaining glass in a 3-block radius, and created a localized updraft so powerful it punched a hole straight through the clouds above, causing rain to immediately begin pouring down on the city. Izuku shielded Katsuki from the blast of wind, his heavy boots grinding against the asphalt to keep from being pushed back. When the dust settled, the villain was scattered across the street, unconscious. All Might stood tall, steaming in the rain. The crowd was dead silent. And then, they erupted into deafening cheers. The aftermath was a blur of flashing red and blue lights. Katsuki was surrounded by pro heroes, receiving endless praise for his powerful quirk and his endurance. "You held out for so long. You'll make an amazing hero one day, kid, Death Arms praised, clapping Katsuki on the shoulder. Izuku, on the other hand, was currently receiving a vicious lecture from Kamui Woods and a police officer. What were you thinking, kid? Kamui Woods scolded, pointing at the massive, cratered footprints Izuku had left in the asphalt, and the sheer destruction of the area where he had ripped the villain apart. Using a quirk of that magnitude without a license is highly illegal. You have no control over your output. You shattered the street, you nearly tore the villain's core in half, and you could have seriously injured the hostage. I know, Izuku mumbled, slouching his broad shoulders, his hands buried deep in his pockets. The adrenaline had faded, and the familiar, crushing weight of his anxiety had returned. He had caused collateral damage. He was a hazard. I'm sorry. My legs moved on their own. A few minutes later, the heroes let them go. Izuku began the long walk home, the rain soaking his ruined uniform. He felt utterly drained. Hey! Deku! Izuku stopped, his heavy boots splashing lightly in a puddle. He turned to see Katsuki stomping toward him, soaking wet, his crimson eyes burning with a complex mix of rage, humiliation, and something entirely unreadable. Katsuki stopped a few feet away, panting. I didn't ask for your help. I didn't need saving from a freak like you. I was fine. You didn't do anything but show off that stupid, brute strength of yours. Don't you dare think you're better than me, you hear me? You're still just a damn nerd who breaks everything he touches. Katsuki didn't wait for an answer. He spun on his heel and stormed off into the rain. Izuku watched him go. He didn't feel angry. He just felt sad. Kaken was right. He had acted recklessly. I am here. Izuku flinched as All Might suddenly slid out from a nearby alleyway, skidding across the pavement in his muscular form. All Might? Izuku gasped. What are you doing here? How did you get away from the reporters? Ha ha! Standing for interviews is a breeze for. All Might coughed violently, a geyser of blood erupting from his mouth as his massive physique deflated like a popped balloon. He hunched over, wiping his mouth, returning to his skeletal true form. Ah, damn it! Izuku panicked. Are you okay? I'm so sorry I got in your way again. Young man, Toshinori interrupted, his voice quiet but commanding. He stood up straight, locking eyes with Izuku. I came here to thank you. And to apologize. Izuku blinked. Apologize? To me? But I caused so much trouble. The heroes yelled at me. I used my quirk dangerously. You did, Toshinori agreed, nodding slowly. You used raw, unbridled force. It was terrifying. But of all the people there today, of all the pro-heroes with their licenses and their training, you were the only one who moved. Izuku's breath hitched. You told me you were terrified of your own strength, Toshinori said, stepping closer. You told me you were a hazard, but when that boy's life was on the line, your body moved before your brain could calculate the risks. That instinct, that selfless drive to act when no one else will, that is the truest mark of a hero. Tears pricked the corners of Izuku's eyes. For 10 years he had been told his body was a curse. A weapon. A liability. You can become a hero, Toshinori said, the words ringing with absolute certainty. Izuku's knees buckled under his immense weight. He dropped to the wet pavement, clutching his chest, sobbing loudly into the rain. The words he had waited his entire life to hear, from the one person whose opinion mattered most. Toshinori watched the boy cry, a soft smile on his face. He waited for Izuku to collect himself, to wipe the tears from his eyes. I've deemed you worthy of my power, Toshinori said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. My quirk is yours to inherit if you want it. Izuku stopped sniffing, his brain abruptly rebooting. Huh? Inherit? What do you mean? Quirks are genetic. You can't just give someone a quirk, Toshinori chuckled. Mine is an exception. It's a sacred torch, passed down from generation to generation. It is the crystallization of power, stockpiled by the voices of the past, cultivated to smash through the darkness. It is called One for All. Toshinori explained the history of the quirk, the passing of the torch. Izuku listened, his mind spinning, calculating the sheer mathematical impossibility of a stockpiling quirk that had existed for generations. I have been looking for a successor for a long time, Toshinori said, looking at Izuku's heavily muscled, tight and dense physique. Usually, a quirkless vessel would need months, perhaps years of agonizing physical training just to build a body capable of holding this power. If an unprepared body receives one for all, the sheer kinetic backlash would blow their limbs clean off. Toshinori stepped forward, poking a bony finger against Izuku's solid, iron-like pectoral muscle. But you are an anomaly, young Midoriya. Your body is an impenetrable fortress. Your muscle fibers, your bones, they are already capable of withstanding catastrophic kinetic loads. You are, quite literally, the perfect vessel. Izuku stared at his own hands. With your baseline strength combined with one for all. Toshinori's voice grew solemn. You will be a god among men. You will possess power that no mortal was ever meant to hold. But power is just a tool. The challenge for you will not be learning how to use it. It will be learning how to hold it back. Can you carry that weight? Can you wield the power of a god, and still be the gentle boy who saves people with a smile? Izuku stood up. He looked at Toshinori. He thought about the fear in Kaken's eyes. He thought about the helpless civilians. He thought about his own fear, the glass world he lived in. He didn't want to live in fear anymore. He wanted to be the shield that protected the glass. Izuku didn't slouch. He stood at his full height, rolling his broad shoulders back, allowing the true, imposing nature of his physique to show. He looked All Might in the eye, his gaze unwavering. I accept, Izuku said softly. Toshinori grinned. Excellent. The UA entrance exam is in 10 months. We have a lot of work to do. The training began the very next morning. Toshinori didn't take Izuku to Dagoba Municipal Beach Park to haul trash. He took one look at Izuku effortlessly lifting a rusted, 3-ton pickup truck over his head with a single hand, and realized that physical conditioning was entirely pointless. Izuku's body was already maxed out. Instead, Toshinori rented a massive, subterranean warehouse on the outskirts of the city, heavily reinforced with shock-absorbing steel plates and concrete pillars. This was not a gym. It was a dojo. Your problem, Midoriya, is that you treat your body like a bomb, Toshinori lectured, pacing the floor in his muscle form, his massive arms crossed. You either give 0%, or you give everything and risk destroying the city. There is no nuance. No technique. You are a brawler who refuses to brawl. Izuku stood in the center of the room, wearing a simple gray tracksuit, nodding diligently. For the next 10 months, we are going to teach your muscles how to redirect force, not just exert it, Toshinori boomed. We are going to teach you martial arts. Boxing for precise, localized strikes. Judo for using an opponent's weight against them. You will learn to control your output with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Right. Izuku said, bowing. And there's one more thing, Toshinori grinned, a feral, battle-hungry look entering his shadowed eyes. He cracked his knuckles, the sound like gunshots echoing in the empty warehouse. You've spent your whole life holding back because everything around you breaks. But All Might lunged forward, moving faster than the eye could track. He threw a right cross, packing enough force to level a city block, stopping it a millimeter from Izuku's nose. The air pressure alone blew Izuku's hair back and cracked the concrete beneath his feet. I do not break, All Might whispered, his grin widening. I am the only person on this planet you can hit without holding back. So, come at me, young Midoriya. Show me what you're really made of. For the first time in his life, Izuku smiled during a fight. A genuine, unrestrained smile. He didn't have to tiptoe. He didn't have to worry about shattering bones or crushing organs. He could just let go. Izuku shifted his stance, planted his heavy boots, and threw a punch. The resulting shockwave rattled the structural foundation of the warehouse. For 10 grueling months they sparred. It was a terrifying display of localized natural disasters. The warehouse was constantly filled with the deafening boom of sonic booms, the screeching of tearing steel, and the thunderous impact of two titans clashing. Izuku learned that his density made him slow to accelerate, but once he was moving, his momentum was unstoppable. All Might taught him how to use footwork to minimize his ground contact time, allowing him to move faster without destroying the floor beneath him. He learned how to throw a punch that stopped exactly where he wanted it to, dissipating the kinetic energy into the air rather than into his target. He learned how to grapple, using his immense weight to pin All Might without having to squeeze and risk cavitation. He didn't just learn how to fight. He learned how to inhabit his own body without fear. By the time February arrived, the air was bitterly cold, but Izuku felt warmer and lighter than he ever had in his life. It was the morning of the UA entrance exam. Izuku stood outside the warehouse, the rising sun casting a golden glow over his face. He was wearing his middle school uniform, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He looked the same, broad, thick, and intimidating, but the slouch was gone. The nervous, twitchy energy was replaced by a calm, grounding stillness. He didn't look like a boy afraid of a glass world. He looked like an anchor. Toshinori stood before him in his skeletal form, bundled up in a thick winter coat. He held a small, golden lock of hair in his hand. "You've done perfectly, young Midoriya," Toshinori said, his voice filled with overwhelming pride. "You've mastered the vessel. You've honed the blade. Now, it's time to light the fire." Toshinori held out the strand of hair. "Eat this." Izuku stared at it. His analytical mind, which had spent 10 months calculating physics, kinetic energy, and martial arts forms, ground to an absolute halt. "Huh!" Izuku deadpanned. "To inherit the quirk, you must ingest some of my DNA." Toshinori explained, laughing awkwardly. "It doesn't matter what it is. A hair, a fingernail, a drop of blood. But the hair is the easiest. Now hurry up, you're going to be late." Izuku swallowed hard, picked the hair from Toshinori's hand, and popped it into his mouth. He chewed once, grimaced at the dry, bristly texture, and swallowed. He stood there for a moment, waiting. He flexed his dense hands. I don't feel any different," Izuku noted. "It takes a few hours for the stomach acids to break down the DNA and integrate the quirk factor into your system," Toshinori explained, checking his watch. "By the time the practical exam starts, you should feel it. But remember, Midoriya, you are already incredibly strong. 1 for all is an immense multiplier. Do not use it unless absolutely necessary. Rely on your base strength. Rely on your control." "I will," Izuku promised, bowing deeply. "Thank you, All Might. For everything." Izuku turned and began the walk toward UA High School. His footsteps were still heavy, but they were measured. Controlled. He felt a strange, tingling warmth beginning to blossom in the pit of his stomach, a spark of energy that felt entirely alien, yet incredibly comforting. The vessel was ready. And the world was about to find out exactly what happened when the unbreakable boy stopped holding back. The gates of UA High School were monolithic, towering arches of steel and glass that seemed to scrape the crisp, blue morning sky. To the thousands of hopeful applicants pouring through the front courtyard, they represented a threshold between ordinary life and the realm of legends. To 14-year-old Izuku Midoriya, they represented a nightmare of structural liabilities. He stood a few dozen yards from the entrance, his broad, densely muscled shoulders relaxed beneath his middle school uniform. He was performing his usual morning calculus. The pavement here is a specialized concrete blend, likely reinforced for high foot traffic and low-level quirks. I can walk normally, provided I keep my weight distributed evenly on the soles of my shoes. But there was a new variable in his equations today. Deep within his stomach, beneath the heavy, steel cable fibers of his abdominal muscles, burned a tiny, radiant sun. It was a warmth he had never felt before, a secondary heartbeat that thrummed in time with his own. 1 for all. It had taken effect sometime during the middle of the night, waking him up with a feverish spike in his core temperature. The sheer, stockpiled energy of 8 previous generations was now resting comfortably inside his impenetrable vessel. Toshinori had warned him that most inheritors felt as if their limbs might explode. Izuku just felt like he had drank a particularly warm cup of tea. His body was so overwhelmingly dense that the immense pressure of the quirk was completely contained. "Out of the way, Deku." The voice was a low, aggressive growl. Izuku didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head to see Katsuki Bakugo walking past him, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his crimson eyes narrowed into furious slits. "Good morning, Kaken," Izuku said, his voice polite and soft. Katsuki stopped. He looked Izuku up and down, taking in the sheer, imposing width of the boy's chest and the calm, unbothered expression on his face. Katsuki's jaw clenched. He hated that calmness. He hated that Izuku never looked at him as a threat anymore. He just looked at him with the same cautious gentleness one might use when approaching a temperamental stray cat. "Don't stand there looking at me like you've already won," Katsuki snarled, a wisp of smoke curling from his right pocket. "This exam is about taking out villains. You think you can just wander around breaking things? The judges aren't going to pass a walking wrecking ball." "I'm going to be careful, Kaken," Izuku replied simply. "I've been practicing." Katsuki scoffed loudly. "Practicing what?" "How to not crush your own pencil." "Don't make me laugh. I'm going to get the highest score in the history of this school, and you're going to get disqualified for snapping a street lamp in half. Watch your back." Katsuki stormed off, his boots aggressively slamming against the pavement. Izuku watched him go, a small sigh escaping his lips. He resumed his slow, measured walk toward the main building. He was so focused on calculating the kinetic energy of his footsteps that he almost didn't notice the girl walking right beside him until she tripped over her own feet. Wah! The girl, who had short, bobbed brown hair and round, rosy cheeks, pitched forward, her arms flailing as she fell toward the hard concrete. Izuku's reflexes, honed by 10 months of martial arts training with all might, engaged instantly. However, his conscious mind had to override his muscles in a fraction of a millisecond. Do not grab her arm. If you exert grip force on a falling object, you will dislocate her shoulder or crush her humerus. Intercept the center of mass. Izuku stepped forward, sliding his heavy boot across the pavement to anchor himself. He reached out with terrifying gentleness, sliding his thick hand underneath the strap of her backpack, right between her shoulder blades, and simply stopped her downward momentum. He didn't pull her up. He just became an immovable shelf for her to rest against. The girl gasped, hovering inches from the ground, suspended solely by Izuku's hand holding her backpack strap. "Whoa," she breathed, looking down at the concrete, then twisting her head to look up at Izuku. "Thank you? I totally thought I was going to eat pavement right there." Izuku slowly, carefully rotated his wrist, helping her stand back up on her own 2 feet. Once she was balanced, he immediately pulled his hand back, stuffing it into his pocket. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked, hunching his shoulders slightly to make his broad frame appear less intimidating. "I'm great. Just nervous," the girl laughed, rubbing the back of her head. She looked at him closely, taking in his unusual build. "Wow, you're really solidly built, huh? When you caught me, it felt like hitting a brick wall." "Oh. I'm Achiko Uraraka, by the way." "Izuku Midoriya," he stammered lightly. Her casual demeanor threw him off. Most people flinched when they accidentally bumped into him. "And yes. My quirk makes me very dense. I have to be careful." "Well, it's a great quirk for catching klutzes like me." Uraraka beamed, clasping her hands together. "Good luck in the exam, Midoriya. Let's both do our best." She waved and jogged off toward the entrance. Izuku stared after her, a tiny, genuine smile playing on his lips. She hadn't looked at him with fear. It was a good start to the day. The written portion of the exam was agonizing, but not because of the academic content. Izuku's mind was brilliant. He breezed through the math, history, and language sections with time to spare. The agony came from the physical act of taking the test. He was seated at a standard Ishiyui wooden desk, surrounded by hundreds of other students in a massive auditorium. He had brought his custom aluminum pencil, but he still had to interact with the delicate optical scan bubble sheet. If he pressed down even a fraction of an ounce too hard, the graphite would pierce the paper and embed itself into the desk. By the time President Mike took the stage for the practical exam orientation, Izuku was covered in a thin sheen of sweat, entirely from the mental exhaustion of holding himself back. President Mike, a loud, blonde hero with a directional speaker around his neck, laid out the rules of the practical exam. It was a massive urban combat simulation. Students would be destroying robotic villains for points, 1-pointers, 2-pointers, and 3-pointers. And then there's the 0-pointer. President Mike yelled, striking a pose. An arena trap. It's a massive obstacle. My advice? Run away from it. Suddenly, a tall, severe-looking boy with glasses and neatly parted blue hair stood up, his arm rigidly raised. Excuse me. May I ask a question? The boy boomed, his voice carrying effortlessly without a microphone. He pointed to his pamphlet. There are 4 villains listed here. If this is a misprint, the top hero academy in Japan, should be ashamed. Furthermore, the boy whipped around, pointing a stiff, accusatory finger directly at Izuku, who was sitting near the back, quietly muttering to himself about the armor-plating specifications of the robotic villains. You, with the messy green hair. The boy barked. Your incessant, deep muttering is highly distracting. It sounds like a diesel engine idling in the room. If you are not taking this seriously, you should leave immediately. The auditorium went dead silent. Everyone turned to look at Izuku. Izuku blinked. He hadn't realized his muttering had gotten so loud, but his voice was naturally resonant due to the thickness of his vocal cords. He looked at the boy, then slowly stood up. When Izuku stood, the full breadth of his physique was apparent to the rows around him. He didn't look like a middle schooler. He looked like a professional heavyweight boxer squeezed into a Gakurin uniform. The boy with the glasses visibly stiffened, suddenly realizing the sheer mass of the person he had just yelled at. I apologize, Izuku said, bowing respectfully, perfectly controlling his descent so his head didn't snap forward and generate a gust of wind. I was just analyzing the material. I will be quiet. He sat back down gently, the wooden chair creaking ominously in protest. The blue-haired boy swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses. Ahem. Very well. Thank you for your cooperation. President Mike cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Right on, Examinee 7111. Thanks for keeping the vibes in check. The 0-pointer is just an obstacle. Now, head to your assigned battle centers, and plus ultra. Battle Center B was a breathtaking logistical feat. It was a fully realized, to-scale replica of a multi-block urban district, complete with towering skyscrapers, narrow alleyways, and functional streetlights. Dozens of examinees stood behind the massive steel gates, stretching and warming up their quirks. Izuku stood near the back of the pack, doing deep breathing exercises. He visualized his body as a massive, overflowing reservoir. The dam was his conscious control. He just needed to let out a trickle. Just enough to break the robots, not the city. He noticed the blue-haired boy from the auditorium, who was doing aggressive calf stretches, and Uraraka, who looked slightly pale and nervous. Izuku debated walking over to wish her luck, but before he could take a step, a booming voice echoed from the loudspeakers. And start! President Mike yelled. The other students hesitated, confused by the lack of a countdown. Izuku did not hesitate. All Might had drilled it into him. Villains don't give you a countdown. When the bell rings, you move. Izuku engaged his leg muscles. He didn't use a full sprint that would shatter the pavement and cause collateral damage to the students behind him. Instead, he utilized the low-impact, gliding footwork All Might had taught him. To the other examinees, it looked like a magic trick. 1 second, the massive, broad-shouldered boy was standing in the back. The next second, a powerful gust of wind whipped through their hair, and he was gone, a blur of dark uniforms shooting through the opening gates at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour, his footfalls unnervingly silent. What are you waiting for? President Mike screamed from the tower. There are no countdowns in real battles. Run! Run! The crowd panicked and surged forward. Deep within the city, Izuku came to a sudden halt, sliding gracefully on the soles of his shoes to bleed off his momentum. He found himself in a wide intersection. Clank! 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 From the alleyway to his left, 3 robots rolled out. 2 1-pointers, resembling large, single-wheeled monobots with laser turrets, and 1 3-pointer, a massive, heavily armored tank-like machine with multiple mechanical arms. Target acquired, the 3-pointer chimed in a robotic monotone. Izuku took a breath. He raised his hands, settling into a classic boxing stance, his dense fists hovering near his chin. Target analysis, Izuku thought, his eyes scanning the metal chassis. Standard steel plating. Probably 3 inches thick. Inner circuitry is fragile. If I hit it too hard, the kinetic transfer will blow the robot backward through the building behind it. The two one-pointers fired low-caliber rubber bullets. Izuku didn't even bother to dodge. The rounds struck his chest and face, bouncing off his dense epidermis like dried peas flicked at a brick wall. Izuku stepped forward. He didn't use one for all. He just used the base strength of Titan Dents. He threw a perfectly controlled left jab. He didn't even make physical contact with the three-pointer. He stopped his fist a full 3 inches from the machine's armored torso, but the localized air pressure generated by the sheer speed and density of his arm moving through the space acted like a solid, invisible battering ram. Crunch! The invisible shockwave hit the three-pointer. The 3-inch steel plating instantly crumpled inward, caving into the central chassis. Sparks flew, internal wires severed, and the machine's red optical sensors flickered out. It slumped forward, completely neutralized. Izuku didn't pause. He pivoted on his heel, swinging his right arm in a wide, sweeping arc. The wind pressure generated by his arm cleaved through the air, hitting the two one-pointers and snapping their delicate wheelbases in half, sending them crashing to the pavement. 5 points, Izuku muttered. Control is holding. No collateral damage to the pavement. High above the mock city, in a dimly lit observation room, the faculty of UA High sat in front of a wall of massive monitors. We have quite a crop this year, Midnight, the R-rated hero, purred, watching a monitor where Katsuki Bakugo was violently detonating a group of two-pointers. That explosive boy has incredible combat instincts. Indeed, Snipe nodded, adjusting his cowboy hat. But look at Center B, Examinee 7112. The Midoriya kid. On the center screen, Izuku was systematically dismantling a pack of robots. He wasn't using flashy elemental powers. He wasn't screaming. He was moving with the terrifying, clinical efficiency of an industrial meat grinder. He would approach a robot, deliver a single, impeccably measured strike, often stopping short to use air pressure, and the machine would fold like origami. His file says his quirk is a mutant-class physical enhancement, Cementos rumbled, leaning forward to get a better look. But the sheer kinetic output, that's not just enhanced strength, that's catastrophic. Sitting in the darkest corner of the room, wrapped in a yellow sleeping bag, Shota Aizawa, the underground hero Eraserhead, stared intensely at Izuku's monitor. His dry eyes tracked every minute movement of the green-haired boy. Aizawa wasn't easily impressed by raw power. He had seen countless brutes with super strength fail because they lacked control, relied too heavily on their quirk, and destroyed everything around them. But Izuku was different. Aizawa could see it in the boy's footwork. He's terrified, Aizawa rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, though the other teachers heard him. Terrified, Eraser? Present Mike asked, confused. He's destroying everything in his path without breaking a sweat. He's got 45 points already. Look at his feet, Aizawa said, pointing a bandaged finger at the screen. With that kind of mass and kinetic output, his steps should be cratering the pavement every time he changes direction. But he's actively suppressing his own momentum. He's bleeding off his kinetic energy into the air rather than the ground. Every punch he throws is pulled at the last microsecond to avoid transferring shockwaves into the surrounding buildings. Aizawa unzipped his sleeping bag slightly, a grim, fascinating smile touching his lips. He's not fighting the robots. He's fighting his own body to make sure he doesn't accidentally level the city block. That kid has the power of a tactical nuke, and he's treating it like a surgeon's scalpel. Sitting nearby in his emaciated true form, Toshinori Yagi practically glowed with pride. You see them, Aizawa? He is the perfect vessel. And he hasn't even tapped into my power yet. Well, Nizu, the principal, spoke up from his high chair, sipping a cup of tea. He was a small, white animal, part mouse, part dog, part bear. Let us see how our young surgeon handles a blunt instrument. It is time for the final test. Nizu pressed a large red button on his console. Down in Battle Center B, Izuku had just lightly tapped a two-pointer on the head, sending a controlled kinetic shock down its spine to short-circuit the battery, when the ground began to tremble. It wasn't a localized tremor. The entire city block was shaking violently. At the end of the main avenue, a massive section of the street exploded upward. From the dust and debris rose a machine of incomprehensible scale. The zero-pointer. It was a towering behemoth of green steel, easily the size of a 20-story building. Its single, glowing red eye swept over the street, and it raised a massive, tank-treaded arm, slamming it into a nearby skyscraper. The building groaned, glass shattering and raining down on the street below like deadly hail. Panic erupted. The examinees, who had been bravely fighting the smaller robots, immediately turned and fled. Run! It's the zero-pointer! That thing is way too big! We're gonna get crushed! Izuku stood his ground. The wind generated by the robot's movements whipped his hair around his face. He watched the massive machine, his mind instantly calculating. Size, approximate, 60 meters. Weight, several thousand tons. The objective is to avoid it. Fighting it yields 0 points. The most logical action is retreat. Izuku turned to jog away, but a sharp cry cut through the sound of the grinding gears. Ow! Izuku snapped his head back. About 50 yards away, near the base of the massive robot, Achiko Uraraka was trapped. A large chunk of concrete rubble from the damaged building had pinned her leg to the ground. She was struggling to push it off, but she was exhausted, clutching her stomach and looking up in absolute terror as the zero-pointer raised its colossal foot, directly over her. The blue-haired boy with glasses was running past Izuku. He saw Uraraka, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then kept running, his face pale with fear. He's leaving her, Izuku realized. The dam in Izuku's mind broke. There was no time for careful calculations. There was no time to bleed off kinetic energy. He didn't activate one for all. He didn't need the power of 8 generations to save one girl. He had his own power. Izuku dropped his stance, bending his knees deeply, digging his heavy boots into the pavement. He engaged every single braided steel fiber in his quadriceps and calves, tight and dense, unrestricted. Izuku launched himself. The sound was apocalyptic. The concrete beneath him didn't just crack. It pulverized into fine gray powder. A massive crater 30 feet wide blew out from his launch point, sending chunks of asphalt flying like shrapnel. To Uraraka, it looked like a dark green meteor had just shot past her vision. Izuku soared through the air, covering the 50-yard distance in an instant. He ascended vertically, matching the height of the falling, colossal foot of the zero-pointer. He pulled his right arm back. His muscles bulged, the sheer density of his flesh straining against the sleeves of his uniform. He didn't stop a few inches short this time. He didn't use air pressure. He aimed a base-strength uppercut directly into the center of the zero-pointer's armored torso. Smash! The physical contact between Izuku's fist and the reinforced steel chassis created a shockwave so violent it visibly distorted the air. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap detonating at ground level. The kinetic transfer was absolute. The zero-pointer, a machine weighing thousands of tons, halted its downward stomp instantly. The steel plating around Izuku's fist didn't just dent, it shattered inward, the entire skeletal structure of the robot caving in on itself. The force of the uppercut defied gravity, lifting the colossal machine clean off the ground for a split second, its massive head snapping backward, before the entire structure crumpled. Explosions tore through its joints as the kinetic energy ripped through its circuitry. The zero-pointer fell backward, crashing into the empty, ruined cityscape with a localized earthquake that knocked several fleeing examinees off their feet. Silence descended on Battle Center B. A heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of raining debris and sparking wires. Izuku plummeted back to the earth. He landed in front of Uraraka, his knees bending to absorb the impact, creating another, smaller crater in the pavement. He slowly stood up, letting out a long, heavy breath. He looked at his right hand. The knuckles were slightly red, and the sleeve of his uniform was completely torn off from the friction, revealing a massive, incredibly muscular arm that looked like it belonged on a Greek statue. But nothing was broken. He turned around, his face instantly dropping his intense, battle-ready scowl, reverting to his usual, slightly panicked, gentle expression. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked, quickly dropping to a knee beside Uraraka. He reached out with terrifying caution, grabbing the massive chunk of concrete pinning her leg. He lifted it as easily as if it were made of styrofoam, tossing it aside. Uraraka just stared at him, her mouth hanging wide open, her eyes darting from Izuku to the smoldering, utterly annihilated carcass of the zero-pointer. "You!" she squeaked, pointing a trembling finger at the ruined Leviathan. You just punched it. Why yeah, Izuku muttered, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. I hope I don't get in trouble for property damage. The pamphlet didn't specify the liability rules for the zero-pointer. 50 yards away, the blue-haired boy and the rest of the examinees stared in absolute, paralyzing awe. They had thought Izuku was strong before. Now they realized they were in the presence of an entirely different species. Time is up. President Mick's voice rang out, sounding slightly breathless. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. He helped Uraraka to her feet, careful not to squeeze her hand too tightly. The exam was over. He just hoped his surgical control in the first half was enough to offset the massive crater he had just left in the street. 1 week later, Izuku sat in his bedroom, staring intensely at the small, metal disc resting on his reinforced steel desk. His mother, Inko, paced anxiously in the hallway, gnawing on her fingernail. Suddenly, the disc whirred to life. A holographic projection sprang upward, illuminating the dark room. I am here as a projection, Izuku gasped. All Might? The hologram of the number 1 hero, wearing a sharp yellow suit, smiled brightly. Hello, young Midoriya. I apologize for not contacting you sooner, but I've been quite busy. You see, I am not just a hero. I am the newest faculty member at UA High School. Izuku's eyes widened. All Might was a teacher? Now onto your results. All Might's tone grew serious. You scored an impressive 45 villain points on the practical exam. Your control was phenomenal, minimizing collateral damage perfectly, until the end. Izuku winced. He knew it. The crater. The uppercut. However, All Might boomed, a video screen appearing next to his head. It showed footage of Uraraka entering the judge's room after the exam, begging them to give Izuku some of her points because he had saved her. A hero course that rejects those who do the right thing is no hero course at all. All Might declared proudly. Rescue points. A secondary judging criteria hidden from the examinees. For saving a fellow student from the zero-pointer with zero hesitation, you are awarded 60 rescue points. Izuku's jaw dropped. A total of 105 points. You passed with flying colors, Midoriya. In fact, you've shattered the previous all-time scoring record. All Might held out a hand, pointing directly at the camera, his smile impossibly warm. Come, young Midoriya. This is your hero academia. Tears pricked Izuku's eyes. He didn't sob uncontrollably like he might have years ago. He just smiled, a deep, resonant warmth filling his chest. He clenched his dense, heavy fist. He was in. The first day of school arrived with a brilliant spring breeze. Izuku navigated the massive, sprawling hallways of UA High, looking for Class 1A. He was wearing the standard UA uniform, though his was specially tailored. The school board had read his medical and quirk registry files. His blazer was lined with Kevlar weave to prevent his muscles from tearing the seams when he flexed, and his pants were slightly baggier to accommodate his tree-trunk thighs. He still moved with extreme caution, walking softly to avoid denting the pristine, polished floors. He finally found the door. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, designed to accommodate students with gigantification or mutant quirks. Izuku appreciated that. It meant he didn't have to hunch over quite as much. He reached out, resting 2 fingers against the door, and pushed gently. Inside, the classroom was already lively. Take your feet off that desk immediately. The loud, commanding voice belonged to the blue-haired boy with glasses. He was furiously chopping his hand through the air, marching toward Katsuki Bakugo, who was indeed sitting with his heavy boots propped up on his desk. Huh! Katsuki sneered, leaning back and resting his hands behind his head. And who the hell are you, Four Eyes? I am Tenya Ida, from Semi-Private Academy. Ida declared proudly. And you are disrespecting the very desks that our senior students have used. It is unbecoming of a UA student, Semi? So you're an elite, huh? Katsuki grinned fiercely. I'll have fun crushing you. Izuku stood in the doorway, suddenly feeling exhausted. Kaken was already starting fights. Ida turned, catching sight of Izuku standing in the threshold. Ida's eyes widened, and his entire demeanor shifted from arrogant indignation to stiff, nervous respect. He marched over to Izuku, stopping 2 feet away, and bowed perfectly at a 90-degree angle. "You!" Ida announced loudly. "I apologize for my behavior at the orientation. I completely misunderstood you. You perceived the true nature of the practical exam, didn't you? The hidden rescue points. While I fled, you stayed behind to face that colossal behemoth. You are clearly the superior candidate." The entire classroom fell silent, turning to look at the doorway. Several students gasped in recognition. "Hey, it's that guy!" A boy with red, spiky hair pointed. "The one who once shot the zero-pointer. Man, I was 2 streets over and the shockwave nearly knocked me down," a boy with elbows shaped like tape dispensers muttered. Izuku felt the heat rise to his cheeks. He hated being the center of attention. He raised his hands defensively, backing up a half step. "And no, really, I didn't figure anything out. I just saw someone in trouble and moved." "Midoriya!" Izuku turned to see Uraraka bouncing over to him, her face lit up with a massive smile. "You made it! I knew you would! That punch was so amazing! TCH. A loud, aggressive click of a tongue echoed from the back of the room. Izuku glanced over Uraraka's shoulder. Katsuki was glaring at him, his red eyes burning with a venomous intensity. The fact that Izuku was receiving praise for raw power, the one thing Katsuki wanted to be known for, was eating him alive. "If you're just here to make friends, you can pack up your things and leave." The voice came from the floor. Izuku, Uraraka, and Ida looked down. Lying in the hallway, right outside the door, was a man encased entirely in a bright yellow sleeping bag. He looked like a giant, exhausted caterpillar. The man slowly unzipped the bag and stood up, revealing a scruffy face, bags under his eyes, and a long, messy mane of black hair. He pulled a juice pouch from his pocket and took a slow sip. "It took you all 8 seconds to quiet down," the man said in a flat, deadpan voice. "Time is limited. You kids are not rational enough." The class stared in stunned silence. "A teacher?" Izuku thought, his mind racing. His clothes look worn, his posture is relaxed but guarded. A pro-hero, clearly. But not a mainstream one. Eraserhead. The underground hero. "I'm your homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa," the man said, stepping into the classroom. "Pleasure to meet you. Now, put these on and head out to the P grounds." Aizawa pulled a blue and white UA gym uniform out of his sleeping bag and tossed it onto the nearest desk. The P grounds were a vast expanse of immaculately maintained dirt and track lines. The morning sun was bright, the air crisp. Class 1A stood in a cluster, wearing their gym uniforms. Izuku's uniform, much like his school uniform, was custom-made from a highly durable, elastic polymer weave to prevent him from bursting out of it every time he flexed his dense muscles. "A quirk apprehension test?" The class shouted in unison. "What about the entrance ceremony? Or orientation?" Uraraka asked anxiously. "If you're going to become a hero, you don't have time for leisurely events," Aizawa said, turning his back to them. UA's selling point is how unrestricted its school traditions are. That's also how the teachers run their classes. Aizawa pulled a softball-sized device from his pocket. "You kids have been doing these physical fitness tests since junior high, right? Pitching, 50-meter dash, grip strength. But you were never allowed to use your quirks. It's irrational. The Ministry of Education is procrastinating." Aizawa turned his gaze to the class, locking eyes specifically with Katsuki. "Bakugo. You finished first in the practical exam. What was your best result for the softball throw in junior high?" 67 meters, Katsuki answered, crossing his arms. "Try doing it with your quirk," Aizawa said, tossing the ball to Katsuki. "Step into the circle. You can do whatever you want as long as you don't leave the circle. Give it all you've got." Katsuki smirked. He walked into the throwing circle, stretching his arms. He gripped the ball tightly, a ferocious, feral glint in his eye. He reared back, his palm igniting. "Die!" Katsuki roared. Boom! A massive explosion erupted from his hand, propelling the ball into the sky like a mortar shell, leaving a trail of thick black smoke. The sheer force of the blast made several students flinch and cover their ears. Aizawa held up a device with a digital screen. It beeped. He turned it around for the class to see. 705.2 meters. Whoa! 705 meters? That's insane! A boy with a lightning bolt in his hair cheered. We get to use our quirks as much as we want. This looks like fun. A girl with pink skin and horns laughed. Aizawa's expression darkened. The air around him seemed to chill. Fun? Aizawa repeated softly. You have 3 years to become heroes. Are you going to have an attitude of fun the whole time? He smiled, a terrifying, predatory grimace. All right. New rule. Whoever comes in last place in all 8 tests will be judged to have no potential, and will be punished with expulsion. The class erupted in panic. Expulsion? On the first day? That's unfair. Uraraka cried out. Natural disasters, massive accidents, egomaniacal villains. Calamities that cannot be predicted, Aizawa listed off, his eyes sweeping the terrified students. Japan is covered with unfairness. Heroes are the ones who reverse those situations. If you wanted to talk with your friends after school, too bad. For the next 3 years, you will inflict hardship after hardship upon you. Go beyond. Plus ultra. Overcome it with all you've got. Izuku swallowed hard. Expulsion. He couldn't afford to be expelled. He had to give it his all, but as the first tests began, a glaring issue presented itself. Izuku couldn't give it his all. Test 1, 50-meter dash. Izuku lined up against Ida. Ida's calves transformed into exhaust pipes, his quirk, engine, revving loudly. On your marks, get set. A robotic voice called out. Bang! Ida shot off the line like a bullet, crossing the finish in 3.04 seconds. Izuku took off a split second later. He wanted to push hard, but his brain screamed in protest. The track was made of standard dirt. If he kicked off with maximum force, he would dig a trench 3 feet deep and spray the other students with lethal projectiles of hardened earth. So, Izuku used control. He ran on the balls of his feet, taking rapid, short steps, essentially floating over the dirt through sheer muscular tension. He crossed the line in 5.01 seconds. It was an incredible time for a seemingly normal human, but in a world of quirks, it was just above average. Katsuki watched from the sidelines, his eye twitching. He knew Izuku could move faster. He had seen the green blur during the entrance exam. He's holding back, Katsuki seethed. He's treating this like a joke. Test 2, grip strength. Izuku walked over to the digital dynamometers. A tall boy with 6 arms, Shoji, squeezed his device, the screen flashing an impressive 540 kilograms. Wow, 540 kilos. Are you a gorilla or an octopus? Someone cheered. Izuku looked down at the device in his hand. It was made of high-impact plastic and reinforced steel springs. If he squeezed normally, the device would turn into dust, and he would get a score of 0 for breaking the equipment. Okay, surgical control, Izuku thought, sweating profusely. I just need to apply enough pressure to max out the digital sensor without breaking the mechanical casing. He gripped the handle with 2 fingers. He tensed his forearm, carefully increasing the pressure, listening intently for the microfractures in the plastic housing. The moment he heard a tiny creak, he stopped instantly. The screen beeped. 541.0 kilograms. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. He had narrowly avoided destroying school property. Shoji looked over, raising an eyebrow. 541? You beat me by 1 kilo. Impressive. But you're sweating a lot. Are you okay? I am fine. Izuku chuckled nervously, gently placing the device back on the rack. Katsuki, standing nearby, clenched his fists so hard his knuckles popped. He stopped exactly 1 kilo above the 6-armed freak. He's mocking us. He's mocking me. As the test progressed, the standing long jump, repeated side steps, Izuku maintained a solid, respectable, but distinctly middle-of-the-pack performance. He didn't break any records, but he didn't break any bones either. From the sidelines, Aizawa watched him closely, his dark eyes analyzing every twitch of Izuku's muscles. He's terrified of his own strength, Aizawa noted, pulling his scarf up over his mouth. He's limiting his output to avoid collateral damage. It's admirable, but it's holding him back. If he can't utilize his full power safely, he'll be killed by a villain who doesn't pull their punches. Finally, it was time for the fifth test. The pitch. Uraraka stepped into the circle and threw the ball. Thanks to her zero-gravity quirk, the ball floated up into the stratosphere. Aizawa showed the screen. Infinity. The class cheered. Midoriya. You're up, Aizawa called out. Izuku walked into the circle. He took the soft ball from Aizawa. It felt like a delicate, hollow eggshell in his heavy, dense hand. He stood there, staring out at the open field. He was currently ranked squarely in the middle of the class. He wasn't in danger of being expelled. He could just throw the ball using a fraction of his base strength, get a respectable 200 meters, and walk away. But Izuku thought back to Aizawa's speech. Plus ultra. Go beyond. If he was going to be the symbol of peace, he couldn't just skate by on the bare minimum of his control. He needed to push his limits. And there was a new limit he hadn't tested yet, the warmth in his stomach. One for all. He had the raw, base strength of Titan Dance. But what would happen if he layered the stockpiled energy of one for all on top of it? He didn't want to use 100%. That would likely blow the atmosphere out of the county. But what about 1%? Just a tiny spark, channeled solely into his throwing arm? It's time to test the waters, Izuku decided, his emerald eyes narrowing in focus. He gripped the ball. He visualized the warm sun in his stomach. He pictured drawing a single, thin thread of that energy up through his chest, down his shoulder, and into his right arm. Suddenly, glowing, jagged red lines resembling a circuit board flared to life across his skin, visible beneath the Kevlar weave of his gym uniform. His arm began to hum, emitting a faint, high-pitched whine of suppressed kinetic energy. The air around Izuku grew heavy. The other students fell silent, feeling an oppressive, overwhelming pressure radiating from the circle. Just 1%, Izuku thought, drawing his arm back. Layer it over my base strength. Now, he threw the ball with everything he intended to use. Whoosh! The ball sailed through the air in a respectable arc, landing with a soft thud in the dirt. Izuku blinked. The red lines on his arm vanished. The hum died down. He hadn't felt the kinetic explosive force he had calculated. He had just thrown the ball with normal, non-quirk human strength. 46 meters, Aizawa announced flatly. The class murmured in confusion. Wait, what happened? Did he mess up? I felt this crazy pressure, and then, nothing. Izuku stared at his hands in shock. The warmth of one for all was gone, snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. But his muscles were still dense. His base strength was still there. I erased your quirk. Izuku snapped his head to the side. Aizawa was glaring at him. The teacher's long, black hair was defying gravity, floating wildly around his head. His dark eyes were glowing a piercing, luminescent red. The capture weapon around his neck uncoiled like a nest of snakes. The entrance exam was not rational enough, Aizawa growled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Someone like you was allowed to enroll. You have power, yes. But I saw what you did at the exam. You spent the entire time holding back, only to unleash a catastrophic strike that destroyed a city block and left a crater in the street. And now, you were about to use a power you clearly haven't tested yet. Suddenly, the cloth capture weapon shot forward, wrapping tightly around Izuku's torso, binding his arms to his sides. Aizawa pulled, expecting to yank the boy forward and off balance. Izuku didn't budge. He stood anchored to the ground like a mountain, his heavy boots dug firmly into the dirt. Aizawa's arm jolted from the tension, the teacher clicking his tongue in annoyance at the sheer immovability of his student. My erasure stops the emission of quirk factors, Aizawa noted, narrowing his glowing eyes. I erased the power that was glowing in your arm. But you're still standing there like a brick wall. What are you playing at, Midoriya? Izuku didn't struggle against the bindings. He looked Aizawa directly in the eye, his expression earnest and devoid of defiance. My body is a mutant-class quirk, Aizawa-sensei, Izuku explained calmly. My muscle density and bone structure are permanently altered. You can't erase how I'm built. Aizawa's eyes widened fractionally. A mutant body, but he was about to use an emitter-type power. 2 quirks? Aizawa dropped his erasure. His hair fell back to his shoulders, his eyes returning to black. He released the capture weapon, letting it slacken. A dual quirk, Aizawa muttered, stepping closer to Izuku. He didn't look impressed. He looked angry. That explains the glowing. But it doesn't excuse your recklessness. You have the raw physical power to level buildings, and you're adding an untested energy emission on top of it? What if you had miscalculated? What if the shockwave shattered the windows of the main building and blinded your classmates with glass? Aizawa jabbed a finger into Izuku's solid chest. Power is nothing without control, Aizawa hissed. If you cannot wield your abilities without becoming a walking natural disaster, you are a villain, not a hero. I don't care how strong you are. If you throw that ball and cause unnecessary collateral damage, I will expel you on the spot. The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. Izuku looked down at the dirt. He felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. The glass world. The fear. Aizawa was confirming everything Izuku had spent 14 years terrifying himself over. He's right, Izuku thought. If I can't control it perfectly, I'm a hazard. But then, Izuku remembered the sludge villain. He remembered jumping in to save Kaken. He remembered All Might telling him that his body was the perfect vessel. He didn't need to be afraid of the glass world anymore. He just needed to be precise. Aizawa-sensei, Izuku said, his voice quiet but echoing with a deep, resolute bass. I understand. I won't break anything. Aizawa stared at him for a long moment, searching the boy's eyes for arrogance or falsehood. He found neither. Only an overwhelming, unshakable focus. Aizawa tossed Izuku another softball. Show me. Izuku stepped back into the circle. The class watched with bated breath. Katsuki was leaning forward, his eyes locked on Izuku's form. Izuku took a deep breath. He held the ball in his right hand. He didn't visualize drawing the power of one for all into his entire arm. That was too sloppy. Too broad. He needed surgical precision. He closed his eyes. He found the warm sun in his stomach. He imagined a single, microscopic thread of that energy, wrapping it tightly around the tip of his index finger. Just the finger. The absolute final point of kinetic release. He opened his eyes. He settled into the throwing stance All Might had taught him, a perfect, fluid kinetic chain designed to transfer energy seamlessly from the ground, up through the hips, into the shoulder, and out through the arm. He leaned back, his massive, dense leg muscles coiling like industrial springs. He stepped forward. He didn't slam his foot into the ground. He placed it precisely, absorbing his own shock. He threw his arm forward. It was a blur, breaking the sound barrier instantaneously with a sharp, localized crack. At the exact microsecond the ball left his fingertips, Izuku activated the 1% of 1 for all stored in his index finger, layering it perfectly on top of the monumental kinetic force of his base tight and dense throw. Boom! The ball didn't just fly, it vanished. A massive, concentrated ring of white vapor erupted from the release point, a perfect Mach cone that shot straight up into the sky at a 45-degree angle. The wind whipped around the students, tossing their hair and rustling their uniforms, but the ground beneath Izuku's feet remained completely unbroken. The shockwave had been perfectly directed upward and outward, dissipating harmlessly into the atmosphere. No shattered glass. No cratered dirt. Just a perfect, surgical strike of unimaginable power. Izuku stood in the circle, his arm extended. His index finger throbbed slightly from the sudden influx of foreign energy, but it wasn't broken. His indestructible bones had handled the output effortlessly. He slowly turned his head to look at Aizawa. Izuku didn't smile arrogantly. He just looked relieved, his emerald eyes bright. Aizawa-sensei. I didn't break anything. Aizawa stood perfectly still, staring at the sky where the ball had disappeared. He slowly lowered his gaze to his digital tracker. The numbers were spinning so fast they were a blur, before finally settling with a sharp beep. Aizawa turned the screen toward the class. A terrifying, wide grin stretched across the underground hero's face, hidden slightly by his scarf. 2,405.3 meters. The class erupted into absolute chaos. 2,000 meters? That's over a mile. He threw a softball over a mile, and he didn't even use a flashy explosion or zero gravity. It was pure physical power. Katsuki Bakugo stood frozen, his jaw slack. 2,400 meters. with a single throw. He looked at Izuku, who was rubbing his finger and looking bashfully at the ground while the class praised him. The gap wasn't closing. The wall hadn't been scaled. The monster had just grown wings. DKU. Katsuki couldn't take it anymore. The humiliation, the rage, the sheer, biological impossibility of what he had just witnessed snapped his restraint. He ignited both palms, propelling himself forward with massive explosions, charging straight at Izuku with murderous intent. Tell me how you did that. You've been hiding a second quirk from me this whole time? I'll kill you! Katsuki roared, hurtling through the air. Izuku didn't flinch. He simply turned, raising his broad arms to catch Katsuki, fully prepared to absorb the impact and gently neutralize his child.